Have you ever found yourself in the middle of a heated argument saying things that you would later regret, or just completely shutting down, unable to get your point across? What if I told you that those moments aren't really you talking? Rather, they're coming from a younger version of you, what Dr. Terry Real calls your adaptive child. In this episode, we're diving deep into how we all get triggered and how we all regress into these old patterns, turning partners into adversaries and small conflicts into major battles. But here's the good news. The adaptive child doesn't need to be in charge. Stick with us, because today we're going to explore how you can recognize those moments, step out of your automatic reactions, and put the mature adult back in the driver's seat without losing connection. Are you ready? Let's get into it. Today we're beginning a new series on intimacy. What is intimacy, you might ask? Well, it is our ability to stay in connection with another person, to be okay with knowing someone else fully, even their dark parts, and also letting ourselves be fully known by our partner.
So I am super excited about this series, but I think before we really get into understanding intimacy deeper, we have to talk about what is the most important quality in relationships. And hands down to us, that is the ability for both partners to be able to self-confront, to be able to be honest with ourselves in a way that allows us to address our own relational immaturities and then work on self-correcting those limitations.
So hard to do.
And that is honestly the foundation, the secret to intimacy that most people are missing. Most people are looking for a quick fix, a vacation, a cute little PDF download that has these really cool questions that they can ask each other. But that stuff is really just barely going to move the needle, and it's not going to be sustainable. The truth is that the only thing that is going to really help you stay in love long-term, feeling deeply connected to another human being, is your individual honesty with yourself about who you are as a person to live with.
So my intimacy checklist that I got online isn't really going to just move the needle that much?
Well, as long as the number one item on that little to-do list is to look inward, then it's going to work.
Yeah, that would be a really good checklist.
Yeah.
All right. So let's talk about self-confrontation, since it's so hard. What does this term even mean? Like, I don't even understand it half the time. So Dr. David Schnarch used this language. He uses it a lot, and it means being willing to be honest with ourselves and push ourselves to constantly live up to who we are as our best self.
Right.
It's about having the ability to examine our own behaviors. That's hard. And truly consider the feedback of our spouse and our children without getting defensive. Yeah. There's the grown-up part.
And it's so easy, I think, to just sort of get into a comfortable place in your marriage or in your relationship where you're just comfortable enough.
Yeah.
Where we don't self-reflect anymore, where we fall into certain patterns where maybe one person plays one role, the other partner plays the other role in some particular losing strategy. And then because it's familiar to both of us, probably familiar because it's familiar to maybe what we saw when we were growing up.
Yeah, this is how it's supposed to go.
Right.
Yeah.
Then we both sort of accept these roles that we're playing without necessarily thinking much about it.
Yeah.
When one person is just taking this one up position, the other partner maybe plays the one down position, and then everything just moves along, sort of status quo. And over time, we drift through life without really acknowledging what it's actually like to be with us, to be married to us, to live with us. And we can become very good at denying, avoiding, and failing to recognize the way that we subtly, and then sometimes not so subtly, hurt those that we love. And during that time, we become less knowable to each other. We become less intimate. We become less connected. And resentments creep in because we've moved through life assuming that these patterns that we play out are normal.
Yeah.
And they probably were normal for us growing up, but they're not necessarily the best way to relate to one another.
Yeah, and maybe your partner's just trying to keep the peace, and then it goes from keeping the peace to resentment.
Yeah.
Because because nobody knows how to manage that.
Right. And they just think, well, I didn't know what I didn't know.
Yeah. Oh, well, we got a lot of that.
Yeah.
That's why we're here doing this with you guys today.
Right.
So if I could share maybe one piece of just advice with every newlywed couple, it would be this, right? The number one quality in a successful relationship is the willingness for both people, both partners, to self-confront and live in a state of constant evaluative evolution.
Yeah.
That means not only are we willing to evaluate, but we're willing to evolve based on that new information.
Right.
That's the hard part. Can we take and accept feedback? Can we implement that feedback when necessary? Right. And can we accept that feedback? Not just like, oh yeah, thank you for your input. Go away now.
Right.
Right. But like, you know what? I need to self-reflect. I need to self-evaluate and say, you know, this is an area where I can grow.
Yeah.
That is so hard for people.
Yeah. And I love
it's hard for me.
I love the saying behavior is a language, right? Because it's not just like, oh yeah, I need to do better, but actually to go out and change your behavior. Behavior is how we calibrate, how we know whether we're making those changes
Absolutely.
or not.
Yeah. Yeah.
So loving each other means that we're striving to see all the time what's true in ourselves so that we can be continually progressing, not towards perfection, but towards just growth. It's never about being perfect. I'm never going to be perfect. And I can't expect Robert to be perfect as a partner. It's just about being willing to say to the feedback, like you just said, you know what? You're right. You have a point. I could have handled that differently.
Yeah.
And you know what? I'm going to strive to do that better. I see an opportunity where I can do better next time. And that to me is how we know that we're truly loved and how we also show love and show and love someone else really well.
Yeah. We got to get out of our own way. And one of the most important areas to confront in ourselves, moving on, is our triggers.
Our triggers.
Our triggers.
We have to be honest about our triggers.
Yeah. I actually used to get triggered by the word trigger. I was like, everybody's so triggered. It irritate me. You're laughing.
It's true. It's true. He used to hate the word triggers.
Yeah. Like,
quit using the word triggers. I don't want to say the word triggers.
Yeah.
You get triggered.
It's a real thing. So have you ever thought that like, okay, I need to calm down before I say something that I'll regret? I mean, I thought this all the time, but then something takes over and you just can't stop yourself. It's sort of like watching a car crash in slow motion. Like, oh no, and you can't take it back.
Yeah.
And in those moments you wonder like, who the heck's in charge here?
Yeah. That's
what we call being triggered. It's when we lose the mature, wise adult part of ourselves and we give in to something different.
Yes. So when we're triggered, what happens is we're shifting from using that prefrontal cortex, the part of our brain that is responsible for wise, rational thought.
Pre-planning, all that. Yeah.
And we switch into a different part of the brain, the limbic system. This is the body and brain's emotional circuit. So we're switching into a completely different circuit, and it's a more primitive part of us. And primitive, when I say primitive, I mean in terms of our own psychological development, but also primitive from an evolutionary standpoint.
Yeah, absolutely. In those moments of being triggered, sort of our past overtakes the present and we're reacting from these echoes of our own past. Right?
Ooh, I love that word. I love the word echoes that you just said there, because that really is what it is. There are these, you think about an echo. We were just down at Lake Powell and you made this whistle when we were in the canyon, and it was like seconds later, and then that echo came back, the whistle came back. Yeah. And when we're triggered, that's what it is. It's that echo of something from the past.
And the problem is that thing in the past causes us to react.
Yes.
Right. Because we're bringing back all of this old stuff, our old baggage. So I love this quote by, her name is Indra Nooyi. I hope I said that right. She was the former CEO of PepsiCo. And she just had this advice, which was one of my favorite quotes. And it says, act, don't react.
Yeah.
So act how you want to be instead of allowing these triggers to sort of jump on you and overpower you and then switch into something other than this mature person.
So it's funny. I had a really fun question on social media this week, and someone wrote in a comment, can you be overly harsh? Oh, well, that's interesting. Can you be, it's kind of like, can you be kind of pregnant? Yeah. Right. But it reminded me of something that Dr. Terry Real says. He says, I don't believe in the concept of overreaction. Nobody overreacts. And what he means by that is when we're, quote, overreacting, what's really going on is we're not reacting to what's right in front of us.
Right.
We're reacting to our ghosts, our old wounds and our old traumas, those echoes that come back down the canyon, and you hear that whistle come back.
And it spins you up in a different way.
Right.
Absolutely. So this word trauma, probably, I like this. I like the word trauma about as much as I like the word trigger. This word trauma gets thrown a lot, like, oh, I have my past trauma, gets thrown around a lot these days. And some people have really big traumas in their life.
Yeah.
And I don't want to discount that. Right. And most people feel like the word trauma means this catastrophic event, like losing your parent when you were a child, or
Right.
really devastating, right? Like a life-changing event. But most trauma that we experience in life isn't this big T trauma. It's really what we call little trauma, these micro traumas. And it could be something as simple. So we're going to just illustrate. It could be something as simple as when you were a child, you said, Mom, I'm hurt. Like, can you help me? And she's like, okay, hang on, let me just finish this email and then I'll be right over.
Mm-hmm.
So now you feel neglected, or that your needs aren't important. And,
right.
And then you're going to react a certain way when someone tells you to wait, when you think something's important.
I'm not as important as somebody on Mom's computer.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right. And these everyday moments of disconnection where it feels like you were maybe abandoned or you were left to fend for yourself can be really traumatizing. It could also be something obviously bigger. It could be like a more overt controlling type of behavior that we experienced from our parents, where you were told what to do, what to think, how to feel. Either way, yeah, I had that. Either way, when that connection was absent, we developed coping strategies to be able to survive. And this is where we piece together a version of adulthood with the resources that we had back then at the time. And this is called your adaptive child. That's important for this episode. We're going to talk more about that. It's the part of you, the adaptive child is this part of you that adapted to either the conditions of neglect or maybe even as extreme as emotional abuse, right? So, and that can range from anywhere from yelling, shaming, controlling to perhaps passive neglect or covert emotional abuse.
Yeah. And people often say, well, that's not me. I didn't have any trauma, but, and that's sort of how I felt. Right. But now I want you to ask yourself, did you grow up in a family where you were emotionally and verbally connected?
No.
Yeah. Charlotte's going to answer these for us. Did you talk about your feelings?
Not much.
No. When I brought up emotions, how were they received?
We didn't talk much about them.
Yeah. Did someone help me regulate these emotions and feelings?
No.
No. Parents are supposed to regulate children's nervous systems. Did you get that, or were you sort of left on your own to sort of figure it out? I know in my world, it was, boys don't cry and toughen up, rub dirt on it, and you'll get over it. Life is hard.
You were left to fend for yourself a lot.
Yeah. I mean, yeah. As were a lot of kids in the latchkey generation.
Right. Right.
Our parents both worked and we all had keys. We got on the door. Everybody had a chain on their neck.
And this is not to throw parents under the bus, because
Absolutely.
none of our parents were perfect.
Oh.
We're not perfect parents either. We've raised 4 kids. We've gotten a little better with each one. So if you're a parent as well, like, give yourself a little bit of grace, because I think it's so true that we are growing up as adults while we're actually trying to learn to be parents.
Children having children.
Yeah. And our parents were flawed.
Yeah.
We were flawed. We are flawed. But it's important to also recognize that when you didn't get the connection that you needed, you created an adaptive child. And Pia Melody calls this part of us a kid's version of a grown-up. It's a child in adult's clothing. We all have a child in adult's clothing within us. This is the part of us that takes over in heated moments.
Yeah. So let me say this again. When you're emotionally flooded, the wise, mature adult goes offline and the adaptive child takes over. Sort of like a 5-year-old driving a school bus. Like, it's out of control. You're just going to watch this thing happen in slow motion. It's going to crash into things, run over plants, fire hydrants, mailboxes.
I can kind of visualize that as you're describing that. I see this little kid driving the school
Can't
bus.
even see over the steering wheel. Just like, hey, I got this.
This is what takes over when we get quote unquote triggered, or just when things get heated.
Yeah.
So what's the difference between this adaptive child and the wise adult? What's the difference between when the child is driving the bus versus when the wise, mature adult version of us is driving the bus?
I think a good representation of this is think about how 3-year-olds or 5-year-olds think, right? The adaptive child in this situation sees things as black and white. There's no right. difference. It's either right or wrong. It's just what it is.
Whereas, if you've ever talked to a teenager, you know that.
Yeah. But adults, the wise adult in this situation, they see that it's a paradox, that there's nuances, there's gray areas. The
Yes.
adaptive child is this perfectionist, whereas the mature adult is more realistic and understanding, and they realize that humans have limitations.
Yeah.
The adaptive child is relentless and harsh, like I want it now, I want it now, I want it now, right? The wise adult is more forgiving and patient. The adaptive child is rigid, whereas the wise adult may be more flexible, more warm, extends more grace.
Yeah. So overall, the mature adult version of us is more open, nuanced, realistic, forgiving, flexible, warm, humble, relaxed. That's what it is to be a mature adult. And it's everything we need to access to have intimacy with another person. That's the key. But when we catch ourselves being black and white, perfectionistic, rigid, harsh, that's when we're regressing back into our adaptive child self.
So I assume then if your partner is triggered based on what you've learned so far in this episode, it's not a good idea to say,
your child's here.
Your child's here. The adults are talking.
No, I don't think that
wouldn't be a good thing.
That's probably going to just that's probably going to escalate the conversation. The point of this is to learn and recognize it in ourselves, not to necessarily point it out in our partner.
Oh,
but it's good to have a code word. And this is why we talk so much about having a code word. So if you do notice your partner is now got their 5-year-old back in the driver's seat, we're going to use that carrots or whatever your code word is, like we need a break, because you're recognizing that and do it in a way that's compassionate.
Yeah. So here's the truth, right? The hard truth. The adaptive child cannot recruit intimacy skills or relationship skills. It simply doesn't have access to the tools it needs for a mature and loving relationship. And honestly, the adaptive child isn't interested in those tools.
No, not at all. It's going to protect. It's going to be all about me.
Yeah. And this is where many relationship therapies fall short. It's great to learn relationship skills, but the adaptive child won't use them.
No.
The real work is dealing with the part of you that refuses to use those skills.
Okay, I have to say this again, and I wish I could say it 100 more times, because this is the secret underlying foundation of intimacy right here.
Secret sauce coming
up. This is it. Write this down. Okay, the adaptive child is not interested in vulnerability, intimacy, negotiation. Only the wise adult part of you wants that. Only the wise adult part of you will use a relational skill. Your adaptive child will not. So you need to learn to recognize, not your partner, you need to learn to recognize who's driving the bus, your wise adult or your adaptive child, and learn how to put the wise adult back in the driver's seat.
So what causes this regression from the mature adult to the adaptive child? The answer is simple. It really is. It boils down to danger. Not so simple as the fact that just about anything could be perceived as danger, not just physical danger. And sometimes we detect danger when it's not really even there.
Yeah, it can be tricky. So here's how it works. The autonomic nervous system, or the ANS, is constantly scanning your environment, asking, am I safe? Am I safe? Am I safe? Am I safe?
Is this a situation that's caused me stress or danger before?
And there's where it can be defective, where it's caused me this before, right? Yeah. And this happens up to 6 times a second while we're scanning, and it's happening entirely out of our conscious awareness. And as long as the answer that comes back is yes, the mature adult stays in the driver's seat. But the moment that the answer changes to no, the adaptive child shoves the adult aside, takes control of the bus, and now the adaptive child is in charge. And this is when the mindset shifts from we, like you and me, to me, right? This is when the priority becomes self-preservation. And suddenly it's no longer the two of you that are working together toward a solution. You become adversaries that are locked in a power struggle. And it's a zero-sum game of win or lose, like entering your own version of the Hunger Games, where someone in this situation has to win, because that's the adaptive child mentality.
Yeah. I mean, I know we've been in this situation
totally.
Before. Yeah. And when we talk about needing to take a break and words and all those, having a word that will cause this pattern interrupt, this is where that is super important. So now we're sort of there. The child's driving the bus. And what do we do now? Well, before any relationship skills or intimacy skills are possible, you have to shift out of this adaptive child consciousness and get the mature adult back online. The mature adult knows how to think rationally. The adaptive child doesn't, of course, right? And the question about who wins and who loses, or who's right and who's wrong, becomes completely irrelevant, because what matters is, how are we going to stay connected? How are we going to negotiate a win-win? And what are we going to do between the two of us that's best for this relationship?
And that's only possible when the adult's in charge.
Only possible when two mature adults are in charge.
Correct. Yeah, good point.
Yeah.
So how do we change best drivers? Well, the first and perhaps the most important step is noticing when you get triggered immediately. And Dr. Terry Real calls this sensation the whoosh.
The whoosh.
The whoosh. And it's a wave. I think of it like a wave. I like the analogy to a wave because for me, I feel it distinctively come from my feet. It sweeps through my whole body. It's visceral. It's automatic. I don't make it happen. Something senses danger and this whoosh goes through my body. It's that first response. And you're going to want to get to know yours intimately. You're going to want to know what yours feels like. For me, I can describe it to you exactly. I feel it start in my feet. I feel it end in my head. And as it whooshes through my body, my eyes get a little blur and my tongue kind of feels almost like it gets numb a little bit. So whatever your sensation is, that is your fight, flight, freeze response.
Yeah. And as your partner, like I can tell.
Can you?
Yeah. I can tell when you get triggered. And we're doing this, you and I have been doing this for 33 years.
Yeah.
Like I also know the things that will trigger you.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it's compassionate to avoid those things.
Yeah, it really is.
Yeah.
We don't have to jump them down on each other's triggers.
No, we don't.
We don't. And that's fighting dirty right there.
Yeah.
Yeah, it is. So what I want you to do is I want you to take a moment to identify where you sort of fall into this. Do you fight? Do you flight? Are you in fight, flight, or freeze? And remember that freeze for guys sometimes could be this just disconnecting, stonewalling part that we've talked about in the past. And what about your partner? Where do they go when they're triggered, right? And feel free to sort of pause here and reflect, like where you think you fall in the pattern. Charlotte is more
sensations?
fight.
Yeah, I am definitely more fight.
He tends to be more fight. And I don't know that I'm freeze. I'm just more disconnect, I think.
A little
sometimes.
stonewalling.
Yeah. And as we referenced before, Viktor Frankl said, between stimulus and response, there is a space. And in that space is the power to choose our response.
Right.
And I might rephrase that and say, is the power to choose who's driving the bus.
Yeah, I like that.
We have an opportunity to choose at that moment whether we want a grown-up driving or whether we want
the 5-year-old going down, crashing down the street, taking out fire hydrants.
So when we catch ourselves being triggered in this whoosh, it's when we need to quickly shift into some self-regulation practices. And before we can engage in connection and communication, we need to figure out how to calm down and bring the adult back online.
So there's a lot of different practices and they're really simple. Honestly, most of them have to do with breath work. You can try to meditate. You can try tapping. I like to use heart focused breathing where I really focus and concentrate on slowing down my breath. Making a little bit of a sound as I exhale and slow down my exhale. You could splash cold water on your face. You could go for a walk. You could even talk to now that you know that this is maybe your 5 or 6 or 8-year-old self that has come online, be compassionate and have a conversation with them. Like actually visualize that adaptive child sitting beside you. Put your arm around them. Listen to what they have to say. Listen with empathy and compassion, and then let them know, okay, thank you, but you know what? I'm going to handle the situation from here. The adult has got this covered.
Yeah. And so whatever method works best for you, the goal is to shift out of this automatic response into your adult consciousness. Terry Real calls this our second consciousness. And for me, again, I know we've talked about this before, but for emotional regulation, like I grew up just tempers flared a lot. And so Charlotte likes breath work. I like cold plunge because it really helps me temper that space in between. Yeah. I think it extends that space between stimulus and response.
Yeah.
If I'm constantly putting myself in a place where I'm having a rapid stimulus, then I need to figure out how to self-soothe and get back into my zen, I guess is what I might call it.
Yeah. And you're good at that.
Yeah.
For me, I think of it a little bit like being in the ocean. And I'm saying to myself, like, okay, there's that first wave that just flushed through my body. And I'm saying to myself, like, no, I don't want that first wave. I don't want that wave. I'm going to wait for a minute. I'm going to wait and get that second wave. And again, I might have a whole conversation with myself in my head, like, okay, Charlotte, back down. You need to calm down. You need to wait for that second wave. Breathe, breathe, slow your exhale. Tell Robert you need a minute. And then once you kind of calm down a little bit, then think to myself, like, okay, what would be something constructive that I could say right now that would not escalate this situation?
Yeah, that's hard, right?
And like you said, that's because I am a fighter. That's my go-to. And that comes from how my adaptive child learned to cope with the world and how my adaptive child learned to stay safe. And how could I be mad at her about that? I'm not. I'm not mad at her. I have compassion for her. I understand why she created the coping strategies that she did, but that doesn't mean that she gets to negotiate with the adults that are in the room.
I love that.
Yeah.
Here's the rule. Maturity means managing your own adaptive child, not expecting your partner to do it for you. That's not fair to your spouse. And honestly, it will probably just trigger their adaptive child in response. Now we have 2 kids driving the bus.
2 kids driving down the road, taking out fire hydrants. That's going to go well.
Yeah.
Right. So this is really what we've shared with you guys today is honestly the first step to intimacy, really understanding who is driving your bus. And we're going to dive deeper into this in this series where we're going to talk more about how to develop intimacy, but this is the foundation. And then next week, super excited to share something with you guys next week. We're going to talk about Terry Real's relationship grid, which to me is so profound. It's like how I felt about when I discovered the Gottman's work. So valuable.
She's really geeking out on this. You guys are going to love this.
I love it. And you guys are it's going to help you to clearly identify on a graph and look at your pattern of regression and how you regress when your child takes over. And you'll also be able to identify your partners, and such a powerful tool because it shows you how then to stay in intimacy, how to stay in connections. We're excited to share that with you next week.
Next week. All right. So for now, we're going to do some journaling homework.
We like to do that.
I love that. That's sort of been a new thing over the past couple series. So here's the homework if you're ready. Okay. Each day as you go about your routine, start paying attention to when your wise adult self is in the room and when you slip into the adaptive child persona, right? Notice what triggers the switch and how you behave in each state. So write it down. For example, this happened. I felt the whoosh and I tried this method, whatever soothing method you had, in order to bring the wise adult back into the conversation.
Great.
So that's the first one.
Self-awareness exercise. Love it. Number 2 is journal about, go ahead and reflect back on a time in the past when your adaptive child was driving the bus, when they took over and it didn't go well. Okay.
Yeah.
So I want you to write about that experience, write about what you wish you had done differently. And then more importantly, how would you want to handle that in the future? What do you want to do instead next time? And as you journal, remember to forgive yourself. We've all lost it in the heat of the moment. So show yourself compassion, show compassion to that little boy or that little girl that's inside of you who developed these coping mechanisms as a way to survive. The key here is being able to analyze and interrupt, analyze what happened, and then work on interrupting that pattern so it doesn't happen next time.
These 2 things that we've given you are the basis for what we mentioned at the beginning, which is evaluative evolution. If you never evaluate your actions and its consequences, you never evaluate how you move through life, you're rarely going to make a change. You're just going to think things are fine.
Yeah.
But just by this simple act of journaling, this is what happened, this is what I did, and evaluating that, say, okay, well, now I know that I did this and this is what I want next time. What do you want instead? Charlotte's great. Yeah. She tells me that all the time. What do you want instead?
Yeah.
Right. Find out how you want to act instead. And then you can evolve into the better version, your best version of yourself.
Yeah.
So thank you so much for being here today. We're grateful for each and every one of you. And we kindly ask, if you haven't yet, if you please leave us a comment and a 5-star review. It really helps us make a greater impact and help more couples. And if you know anyone that this episode might be beneficial to, would you please consider sharing it with them?
Perfect. And of course, be kind to each other this week. Take care of each other. Remember, it's the small things done often that makes the biggest impact.
Until next time.